On April 15, 2005, Ray Gricar mysteriously vanished and was never seen again. The evidence at the scene looks to many law enforcement to be deliberately staged. All the evidence is laid out on the internet should you want your own interpretation. For years, this rumor has shadowed the case. Was he the subject of a secret criminal investigating grand jury? Grand juries are sealed until the indictment is served on the defendant. So we may never know the answer, but jurors talk, even if sworn to secrecy. But jurors inevitably talk. Nothing stays a secret forever, particularly not in Happy Valley, Pennsylvania. Most experts look at the scene where he disappeared and can't see any viable answer, except a walkaway, a cunning and confusing deliberate exit, and a crime scene with clues pointing in every direction as if to purposefully confuse you. He planted a maze. He bought himself time. He has a sense of humor setting that up. Wild goose chase clues. Most locals don't believe Ray was murdered. If you tell any local Ray is dead, their response is always the same. The hell he is. Where is the damn body then? Most locals to Happy Valley believe Ray might have orchestrated the most complex con in the history of Pennsylvania. And who better to be the most sophisticated criminal of all? Perhaps a prosecutor who studied criminals for 30 long years might fit that profile. A brilliant savant of a felonious mind. The rumor of criminal liability dominates the speculation in a case that became one of the most famous unsolved mysteries of all time. Despite the glorification of the prosecutor by the media, he had a known dark side and lived a double life. He was a persistent womanizer. He was last seen shopping with a tall, dark-haired, beautiful younger woman and showed no signs of distress. Sometimes he did dirty political things. Sometimes there was some misconduct in court. Sometimes he manipulated or lost exculpatory evidence to win. Little things. Maybe overlook a couple rich and powerful serial pedophiles. Oh yes, there was more than one. Perhaps some missing drug forfeiture money. You know, for his getaway. Many theories exist, but those who know him largely believe in one theory. The local legend goes something like this. Jane first saw Ray Gricar initially and thought nothing of it. He wasn't exactly devastatingly handsome. He did not immediately catch her eye. Yet she had caught him looking at her, and he had been quite subtle about it. He was almost coy. Then again, it happened she saw his eyes lingering as she looked up. She began to play shyly with a lock of her blonde hair, intrigued. She gave a half wave and gestured for him to come over, smiling warmly and encouraging it. He picks up his glass of wine and gathers his coat, strolling across the bar in such a casual way. So athletically, dressed almost discreetly in khakis and a white shirt. Initially, he had barely been noticeable at all, she reflected. As he drew closer, she had been somewhat surprised by him. Despite all his bashfulness, he had a strange, unapologetic arrogance, calculated with a charming air of humility. He seemed to be a world of contradictions, she thought. "Hello, I'm Ray," he said simply, sitting down and making himself comfortable. "Where are you from anyways?" Jane had stammered off, distracted by the profoundness of his physical presence. "Here," he says. "Most locals know of each other. I'm from Happy Valley too." "What is your last name?" "I'm originally from Ohio," he explained. He was quiet but bold at times, she noticed. He had this strong, sultry, sexual, and dominant energy, but was disarming at the same time. Something about his character totally mystified her. He studied her with an intensity that sent shivers of desire down her spine and made her feel like he was reading her mind, undressing her thoughts. He said the most perfect things every single time. How had she not noticed him immediately? He exuded raw sex appeal now that he was in front of her. He fascinated her. Ray suddenly stroked the outside of her thigh gently under the table. His touch had startled her initially, which had seemed to amuse him. Then the rawness of the burning chemistry between them caused the world to melt around her. Still, he felt closed off and guarded. She was fascinated by this darkness about him. He didn't dress like he had money, but she could tell by the way he spoke and acted he was well off. She had begun to notice he attracted a lot of attention. But it was nebulous. It was almost sinister, she thought. People looked at him like they were fearful of him. She watched him closely. What an enigma he was. What a fascinating man, she thought. "You can trust me, Jane," he said, reading her mind. He had been doing that all night. It was almost unsettling how intuitive he was. If he wanted to, he could easily manipulate someone. She wondered if he was manipulating her right then. But the electric feel of his hand on her thigh took all her thoughts away. Candlelight flickers around them, and the aroma of garlic and butter fills the room. In time, an older woman in an elegant black dress and pearls walks to the front of the room. She sits down at the baby grand piano and begins to play. Their conversation drops off as they listen. "She's in here every week. I love listening to her," he remarks. "I feel like I've been talking to you all evening. I've likely been talking too much." She had meandered on. She suddenly realized again she had known very little about him. "Do you want to get out of here?" he asked her. She had hesitated for a brief second, and he had caught that. She liked that he was a sensitive man. "I'm not proposing we go home together. I am not that kind of man. Are you a gentleman?" She looked at him coyly. "I would like to think so. Are you a gentleman all the time?" She was now being flirtatious. "I am a gentleman until the right time," he replied carefully. "If I am with a woman as beautiful as you, sometimes I like to do non-gentlemanly things." He was measuring her reaction intently. He enjoyed watching her fumble for words. He liked to watch her mind work. He enjoyed that vulnerable blush. She felt a hot wave of desire pass through her. "I hope someday you do non-gentleman things to me." She was daring, and he had looked very thrilled to see her say it. He knew when to push the boundaries, and he was a rhetorical artist. She looked back at him very curiously. He was waving for a check with an air of authority. She had just figured out what she sensed in him: power. She noticed he had begun to attract more stares from around the restaurant. Many people knew Ray, she had thought. They knew him but appeared terrified. Who the hell is he? She was mystified by him, drawn to him. He had a way of wrapping her up with his words, a linguist in its most brilliant form. "I got a bottle of wine in the car," he says softly. "I know a spot with a view. You want to get the hell out of here?" "Yes," she agrees immediately, suddenly excited to spend even more time with him. They drove into the night until they reached the secluded spot. She thought she knew every little crevice of the valley, but apparently not. "Wow," she gasped as he opened the door of the car and got out. "I've never been here. How did you find this place?" He handed her the bottle of wine and she drank from it, spilling it. Swiftly, he wiped the red wine from her lips and leaned in and kissed her with a passionate intensity that made her very soul ache. He never asked first. He could read her like a book. He knew she wanted it. The sky was clear and the stars seemed to penetrate the atmosphere, burning unusually bright. A perfectly bright, bold moon hung in the sky. She finished her glass of wine and he poured another one. Suddenly, she looked at her watch. "Come on," he says. "Do you want me to take you home or to your car?" "My car is still in the Gamble Mill parking lot. We've had a lot of wine, and I would just be beside myself if anything happened to you. How about this? How about I take you home, and then I can pick you up and take you to your car tomorrow?" "That's so generous of you," she says. "Actually, I'm being very selfish. I just want to see you again." She suddenly realizes he knows a lot about her, and she knows nothing at all about him. "What do you do for a living?" she asks curiously as he fills her wine. "I do very bad things to very dangerous people," he says, almost sneering. "Is it top secret?" She laughed nervously. She couldn't fathom what he did. He was a powerful man. She had sensed that. He was also a man with means. He had hinted several times at that. "What do you do?" he asks, changing the subject. "I work in a boutique clothing store on High Street. But really, that's just how I make a living. I consider myself a starving artist." Emphasis on the word starving. She laughed. "But are you happy?" he asked, winking. "Luckily for you, I make plenty of money." She had to think about it for a minute. "Yes. Right now, yes. I am very happy. I make plenty of money and I'm unhappy. You see, the grass is always greener." "Why are you unhappy?" "I don't like talking about bad things," he said. They finished off the wine and he kissed her some more. "You are making me want to do things to you that are not so gentlemanlike. I need to take you home, baby." She loved it when he called her baby. She was sad to think of them parting. All of it had felt like a dream. He grabbed her by the back of the neck boldly and kissed her with a forceful intensity, his lips biting at hers. Heat surged between them. She suddenly wanted his hands all over her skin. He was bold and dominant, and it seemed went after what he wanted without hesitation or apology. She liked the sheer masculine quality of that. They began to drive the 20-30 minutes back to the valley. "Are you okay?" "You drank a lot," he asked. "I could fall in love with a man like you, Ray," she said impulsively. "I'm sorry." She retracted quickly. "It's the red wine that got me." "Don't apologize," he said, kissing the top of her hand. "I think I'm already very smitten with you. I'm very interested." She looked at his handsome face in the moonlight. How had she barely noticed him there, sitting at the bar? He was dreamy, he thought, as he sped along the little gravel roads on the mountainside. Then, as they were driving, they hit something. It thudded and rolled heavily over the hood. He had smashed into it hard. She'd never in her life be able to forget the sound of the crushing of bones. It all happened so fast. It seemed like a blur. Everything had gone from beautiful to terrifying in a split second. She had seen it out of the slits of her eyes. It was just a blur. He had come quickly around a corner, and there had been a shadow, followed by some thickening thuds of a body rolling over the car. Ray slammed on the brakes, and they had nearly careened off the mountain edge, landing in a shallow ditch. Her heart felt like it was beating out of her chest, and for a few long seconds they were both quiet, listening in the eerie stillness. It was just a deer. she told him. But she saw his nostrils flaring and he studied the rearview mirror with an intensity that scared her. She turned in her seat to follow his eyes. To her horror, she saw it then. A crumpled-up little body was lying there in the road, motionless. "Oh my God!" She started to panic, but he had put his hand over her mouth and looked to be concentrating. For a long time, they just stared in the headlights. It had seemed like hours to her, as she sat paralyzed in fear, both of them watching and waiting as the endless seconds ticked by. Then a piercing scream broke the silence. A male screams. It was a scream she would never forget. It sounded like pure agony. Ray got out of the car and left the door open, sprinting up the little dirt road in the dim lights of the taillights. She followed him, reaching his side as he arrived at the body. A femur protruded from his leg and his neck was contorted at the most unnatural angle. "Can you move?" Ray asked. "No, I can't feel anything," screamed the man, gasping for air and spurting up blood. "Your neck is broken," Ray replied. He was eerily calm as she began to cry hysterically. The man coughed up more blood and she wailed in horror at the sight. "My phone died," she said, "hours ago at the restaurant." Tears are streaming down her face. She had never seen anything so horrible. "Get in the car," he says. She stood there motionless, just staring at him, wondering why. "Get in the car," he repeats. Something about his tone the second time startled her into action. She watched him over her shoulder for a long while. He finally stood up, shaking his head. He opened the trunk of the little sports car, and then he tapped on the window with a metal object. It was a crowbar, she realized. She looked at his face, and it was no longer full of warmth. A hard darkness had seemed to come over him. "Shut your eyes, and don't open them till I tell you," he demanded. She knew what was going to happen next. She had seen that look in his eyes. She shut her eyes, but peeked through her hair. He was walking towards the body, flipping the crowbar from hand to hand so casually, tossing it back and forth with scary agility, a solitary dark silhouette of a man in the glare of the headlights. Then she saw the glint of metal as he leveraged it above his head and sucked in her breath. Then she saw him lower it, striking hard at the body that let out a muffled scream. The man continued to scream in agony as he struck, and then he stopped, but she watched as Ray kept beating the body with chilling violence. She watched him hit that body repeatedly, over and over, to a pulp. It's a bad dream, she thought. He got into the car and put on his seatbelt without looking at her or saying a word. She looked at him. He had blood spatters running down his face, covering his clothes. Some of it was clumped, like flesh. He flew down the mountainside recklessly, peeling around the corners and accelerating at dangerous speeds. She flinches and peeks at him as he drives. His eyes were hard and determined, carefully navigating the road. She could feel the darkness surrounding him and was too terrified to speak. The silence had been tense and profound. He flew down the mountainside recklessly, peeling around the corners and accelerating at dangerous speeds. She flinches and peeks at him as he drives. His eyes were hard and determined, carefully navigating the road. "Did you kill him?" she asked suddenly. But Ray stared straight ahead darkly, blood dripping down his face. Finally, he said, he would have lived a miserable life. His life was worthless after the injuries he sustained. I put him out of his misery. But she had seen the look in that man's eyes, and seen a desperate desire to live in his expression. Who the hell was Ray to decide whether a life was worth living? He didn't take her to her home. He pulled up to her car. She flinched as he reached across her to open the door. "Get the fuck out," he said, looking at her. She looked at him in shock. "You heard me. Get the fuck out. And listen, if you start to run your mouth, I'll take that crowbar and do the same thing to you." She rushed from the car and got into hers, struggling to open it with her shaking hands. She locked it as he was pulling away. For a while, she sat crying at the steering wheel. She had thought about calling the police. "I know all the police in this county." His voice echoed through her mind. She drove home trembling in fear, trying to catch her breath the entire way. Time went by and she thought of it less and less, but she still thought of it every day. The memories flooded back and they were raw. It was Thanksgiving and the height of Black Friday. The stores had been closing. Small drifts of snow had begun to fall outside. The bell to the front door chimed. "We are closed." She told the woman. "I need to make a return," said the woman. "You'll have to come by tomorrow. I've closed the register," objected Jane. But the woman had come and plopped her shopping bags on the counter. "It's a shirt. You have plenty of time. I know the owner." "Fine," Jane sighed. She set the newspaper on the counter as she dug through all her bags. It flipped open suddenly and there he was again. "Excuse me, miss," came the voice angrily. "Did you hear what I said?" Yes, what?" "I want this return in small bills," she said. Jane shut her eyes, breathing heavily, and hung onto the counter to steady herself. "Hello," said the lady in an impatient tone. She opened her eyes and glanced back down at the newspaper, and she was certain it was him. She read the headline: "District Attorney Ray Gricar achieves a winning verdict in the Ruth Fergus trial." And there he was in a suit at the podium, doing some sort of press release. She couldn't unsee him. She finished checking the customer out, went to the bathroom, and got physically sick. That evening, she could not stop thinking of it. Passing a newsstand, she just stared in horror at the sight of him. She went home and lay in bed. She had a drink, but the nightmare replayed over and over again in her mind. She had a searing headache, the type that hurt so badly it made her dizzy. Then it was around Christmas time when it happened. Ray Gricar was walking with his assistant district attorney over lunch. Suddenly, Sloane saw this woman come flying out of a Belafonte Chinese restaurant. She ran smack into Ray, hard. She fell backward and slipped on the ice, crashing onto the pavement, her food spilling all around her. She was confused for a minute. Sloane rushed forward to make sure she is all right and reached for her to help her off the round. But she is staring straight at Ray, and she has this look of terror on her face. "Don't touch me," she said, not moving her eyes off Ray. She begins to crawl backward in horror. "What's wrong with you?" asked Sloane. The girl looked at Ray and then back at Sloane with a desperate look in her eyes. "I can't tell you. I can't say." Then she scrambled to her feet and sprinted away, leaving her food all over the sidewalk. "Jesus," Sloane says. "Did you know that girl?" "I've never seen her." "Wow. She looked like she was terrified of you. She almost looked like she knew you." "She was strung out on drugs," he said angrily. "Did you see it?" "Yeah, I definitely noticed that. The drugs are definitely getting worse in Happy Valley. I keep seeing it more and more." That was just so weird. "Are you sure you didn't know her? She really looked like she knew you.